Fighters like these American P-51 Mustangs were key players in the deadly drama of the Pacific Campaign in World War II. A campaign that began with Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and ended shortly after the bombing of Hiroshima and later Nagasaki, where a single bomb destroyed each city in just a few seconds.
In this special edition of Wings over the Pacific, we will meet Japanese and American pilots who fought over the Pacific. Through archival footage and reenactments, we will see their aircraft in action and relive the major aerial campaigns of a battlefield that covered nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Far from their home waters, Japanese pilots await orders. They are at sea preparing for war, and each day brings them closer to battle. As part of their samurai warrior tradition, they toast Japan and the Emperor. And in the days to come, Japanese crews will be preparing for a mission that will stun the world. The hopes and dreams of Imperial Japan rest with these aerial warriors. In late November of 1941, a Japanese strike force, led by 6 aircraft carriers, sails east under radio silence. A few days later, the commander of Japan's combined fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, sends a coded message to begin the attack. Climb Mount Nitaki. The die is cast. Japan will strike at the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Yamamoto seeks a quick, decisive victory that will force America to the negotiating table on Japanese terms. The time has come. There is no turning back. The plan becomes a reality. Almost 200 aircraft lift off to attack Pearl Harbor. The torpedo and dive bombers will strike at the American ships on Battleship Row, while other fighters and bombers target the airfields nearby. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, known to American intelligence officers as the Kate, leads the attack. Its deadly, long-lance torpedoes adjusted for the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. The Aichi D-3A, codenamed Val, is a slow but highly maneuverable dive bomber. At Pearl Harbor, some Vals carry modified 16-inch armor-piercing shells as bombs to unload on the battleships. On this fateful December morning, the naval base and the men at Pearl Harbor are peaceful. The aircraft at Hickam Field are neatly lined up as if ready for inspection. Soldiers go about their lives, oblivious to the rain of death and destruction heading their way. Although the breaking of diplomatic codes by the U.S. has suggested the possibility of hostile action, no extra security precautions are taken. At 7:49, the first wave of Japanese aircraft attack. The surprise is total. Failure to heed radar warnings proved disastrous, and ships at dock are easy targets for Japanese bombers. Few aircraft even get in the air to protect the fleet. Most of the American planes are destroyed on the ground when the Japanese strike the airfields. For the U.S. Navy, there is but one consolation. Its carriers are out to sea, safe from the attack. As a young ensign, John LaCouture saw firsthand the chaos of that December morning.
I got down to the Officers Club landing, and it was right across from Battleship Row, and boy, I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw all those ships sinking and capsized. The Arizona had already sunk, the Oklahoma had capsized, and I think the West Virginia and the Nevada were badly damaged. Everything, of course, was mass confusion. As we went by one of the airfields there, where our planes were coming in, some of them from the Enterprise, and they were being shot down by our own people, thinking it was a Japanese plane.
At 8:40, the second Japanese strike force of 167 aircraft attacks, but it meets much stronger resistance. Fighter pilot Yozo Fujita lost most of his squadron and witnessed what may have been the war's first kamikaze attack.
When I went to Pearl Harbor, I expected to die. I didn't expect to come back. It's a wonder that I returned. When we attacked, they were ready for us. So 3 out of 9 planes never returned. I watched my group leader self-destruct. He used hand signals to tell us that he had no fuel and was going down to take out the target.
Dense smoke from damaged ships hampers the second attack. Heavy resistance and the unknown location of American carriers caused the Japanese to break off the assault. At the end of the day, 18 American warships lie sunk or severely damaged in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Nearly 200 aircraft are destroyed, most never having gotten off the ground. More than 2,400 soldiers, sailors, and Marines perish defending the fleet. The Japanese lose only 28 aircraft and less than 50 men. For those who survived it, the attack on Pearl Harbor is a swift, intense preview of the ferocious air and sea war that will soon envelop the Pacific. In the war in the Pacific, the battlefield is limitless sky and endless ocean, a campaign far different from the landlocked battlefields of Europe. Aircraft carriers rule the seas. They are mobile airfields, launching aircraft to strike at targets hundreds of miles away, and important targets themselves. It is truly an aerial war, and men, their ships, and their aircraft will determine the victor and vanquished of the Pacific campaign. Japan's aerial offensive continues on the Asian mainland. A Nakajima Ki-43, codename Oscar, takes off to battle British forces in Southeast Asia. In 1941, this is the Japanese Army's most common fighter, and though armed only with a pair of 7.7mm machine guns, its maneuverability makes it a tough opponent for Allied aircraft in the early days of the war. In Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese neutralize Allied air forces. All too frequently, Allied aircraft are caught on the ground, easy targets for Japan's skilled pilots. Battle-hardened Japanese troops advance with lightning speed. They easily defeat the poorly trained British troops, unaccustomed to fighting in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The British will make their last stand at Singapore, known as the Gibraltar of the East. On the naval front, hundreds of Japanese aircraft scour the seas, hunting like birds of prey for 2 British warships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, pride of Britain's Pacific Fleet. The Mitsubishi G3L, codenamed Nell, leads Japan's search. It is their first modern land-based bomber, and its exceptional range makes it an ideal aircraft for this mission. The two great British warships are sighted on the morning of December 10th. Japanese planes begin the attack. The British ships have no aerial escorts to protect them and must twist and turn to avoid wave after wave of torpedo and bombing strikes. They are virtually defenseless against the withering assault from above. The Prince of Wales and the Repulse are doomed. By early afternoon, both ships and more than 800 of their men lie at the bottom of the sea. The Japanese have lost just 3 aircraft. The historic reign of the battleship is over. Japan rules the seas and the skies of the Pacific. The loss of the British ships leads to the unconditional surrender of Singapore to Japan. The foundation of Britain's imperial power in Asia is lost. Like a typhoon, the Japanese have swept aside all opposition. In 6 months, their land, sea, and air forces have redrawn the map of the world. By mid-1942, Japan has gained control of nearly 1/3 of the Pacific. The aircraft leading Japan's air war is the Mitsubishi A6M, codenamed Zeke, but more popularly known as the Zero. More than 10,000 are built during the course of the war. It is fast, nimble, and deadly. In 1942, the Zero is the best performing fighter in the Pacific. But the Zero's high performance does not come without cost. Its light armor and lack of self-sealing fuel tanks make it, for many Japanese pilots, a fiery sarcophagus.
That Zero was a heck of a flying fast piece of equipment. And you had darn well better respect it. When it came down on you, better respect it. On my very first combat strike, I was a tail-end Charlie of the whole darn strike of 48 TBFs. And out of the clouds came 4 Zeros. And I hear my gunner screaming, I got one, I got one. I said, shut up and get another. He did.
If you like to fly, you would prefer this airplane. We often wondered why the Japanese Zero did so many useless nip-ups. Well, I tell you why they did it. Pilots enjoyed it. It was a fun airplane.
冷戦について言うならば、これはもう
In the case of the Zero, in order to maximize its ability, they sacrificed weight. To sacrifice weight means to have almost no armor. It's as if we were fighting with little knives from the sash of our loincloth, while our enemies came in a suit of armor. One little slip, and you were gone.
I've seen many Zeros come apart with just 10 or 12 bullets into them. They were totally unprotected as far as armor plating and so forth. I think as far as the pilot experience goes, the Japanese at that time were very experienced pilots. They were excellent gunners, and the only way we survived was the fact that we had a more rugged airplane.
The Grumman F-4F Wildcat is the Navy's only carrier fighter at the start of the war. It is a tough, rugged aircraft with self-sealing fuel tanks and an armored body that will save many a pilot's life. The toughness of the Wildcat, along with its 650 caliber machine guns, enables pilots to hold their own against the more maneuverable Zero fighters. As war rages in the Pacific, back home, America is on the lookout. Air defenses are readied as the country prepares for war. Remember Pearl Harbor is the battle cry of the day. Thousands of young men enter the service. Women move into the factories, replacing the men who go off to war. U.S. industry is quickly switching to wartime production. Aircraft come off the assembly line and pilots out of training school. Some Americans need no training. In China, the American Volunteer Group, later known as the Flying Tigers, is ready for combat. using the fighter tactics of its commander, Colonel Claire Chennault. The Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks proved deadly to enemy aircraft. Flying Tiger veteran Ed Rector remembers Chennault.
Chennault would lecture each arriving group at 7 a.m. in the morning, a half-hour to 45-minute lecture, and then at 8 o'clock we would be out practicing tactics and maneuvers. He knew the Japanese Zero better than anyone. He had analyzed it. He said, do not ever try to turn with a Zero. If you do, he will turn inside you within 2 turns and get you. If a fighter gets on your tail, stick the nose down, dive out, and with that increased speed, pull up and join the fray. Remember that he does not have self-sealing tanks like you do, and you can perforate those tanks and cause him not to get home.
With their distinctive shark tooth paint job, the P-40s make good their image as vicious predators. Their half-dozen 12.7 millimeter machine guns are deadly, and their sturdy construction enables them to survive. Using Chennault's hit-and-run tactics, the Flying Tigers destroy more than 296 aircraft while losing just 12 of their own. It's not just the planes in the air, but the supplies on the ground that keep the war going. When the Japanese close all land routes, Allied aircraft parts and fuel are bottlenecked in India. The only option is by air, across a 15,000-foot mountain range of turbulent winds, rugged peaks, and lurking Japanese fighters. They call it the hump. Using aircraft like the Curtiss C-46 Commando, the air bridge to China becomes a lifeline to Allied ground and air forces.
We got by with less than 1/4 of the materiel of fighter groups, say, in Europe. Remember, every bullet, every bomb, every gallon of fuel that we used was flown across the hump, airlifted. That became very, very dear in terms of cost, but it kept us fighting. It kept China in the war.
Flying the hump proves perilous. More than 450 aircraft will be lost transporting supplies into China. Aboard the USS Hornet, an even more perilous mission is prepared. Using B-25 Mitchell medium bombers modified with extra fuel tanks, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle plans to lead America's first strike against the Japanese mainland. Doolittle's bold plan is to launch his land-based B-25s from the Hornet, attack Japan, then land in China after the strike. And by returning a captured Japanese medal, he will be sending a personal message to Tokyo. Doolittle's pilots have been practicing mock carrier takeoffs for weeks. But are they ready for the real thing? Will the heavy planes make it into the air with such a short takeoff? Airman Roy Stork remembers taking off.
We'd cross our fingers and do a Hail Mary and say, well, I hope this joker gets off. I thought the plane was going to vibrate apart. Everything was shaking, and then when we released the brakes, it smoothed out. We just jumped into the air. We had to push forward on the stick to keep from stalling out. It was amazing, much more than we expected. It was thrilling, believe me, it was thrilling.
They came in barely over the water. When it lifted up, we saw a star on the side of the plane and realized it was an American plane flying over us to bomb a target. America was so brave to fly land-based planes off carriers.
The low-flying B-25s meet little opposition as they strike Tokyo and 3 other Japanese cities.
They were bragging about the fact that the Japanese mainland had not been attacked for 2,036 years. well, after we hit, they weren't so proud of it anymore, I'll tell you that.
For Doolittle's crews, it was a one-way mission. Fog and lack of fuel caused all the B-25s that bombed Japan to crash land in China. The Chinese rescue all but 8 crew members who were captured by the Japanese. 3 other airmen are killed in the crash landings. The airmen of Doolittle's raid on Japan become the war's first heroes. Today, a half-century later, the bond between these brave men still endures.
Each year we toast the men who have gone and toast the ones that are alive. And it's up to the last 2 guys to drink a toast to everyone. When it's down to 1, he'll drink a toast to all of us.
The B-25 was made famous by the Doolittle raid on Tokyo and was a very versatile and popular aircraft. By the end of the war, American workers had manufactured nearly 10,000 of them. Many of these B-25s were sent to the Pacific with the mission of punishing and destroying Japanese naval and army forces.
Winning the air war over the Pacific requires more than just a stout heart and steady hand. The seeds of our victory are found in the industrial heartland of America, in its capacity and determination to outproduce the enemy. This is a victory also made possible by the men and women on the home front, who worked day and night to produce hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft. In 1942, only 3 American aircraft carriers are afloat. A year later, there are more than 50. By the end of the war, more than 100. By adapting civilian mass production techniques to military hardware, the United States is able to outproduce Japan. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. had 17,000 aircraft on hand throughout the world. The Japanese, almost 7,000. By 1945, when the Japanese reach that level of 17,000 planes, they will face more than 100,000 American aircraft. To launch and retrieve aircraft is risky, backbreaking work. It is a dangerous dance between men and machines on a flight deck in constant motion. Whether they are preparing for torpedo strikes or guiding home wounded aircraft, the deck crews are the lifeblood of the carrier, the Air War's unsung heroes. The carrier's power is in its pilots and aircraft, and the Pacific, with its vast expanse of ocean, is the ideal theater for carrier warfare. USS Yorktown veteran William Leonard remembers the basic rule of combat.
It was not any great mystery that if you didn't defend the carrier, you wouldn't have a place to hang your toothbrush, and it wouldn't have a nice place to come home. So number 1 was defend the carrier. But you can't defend the carrier by just standing there and manning the walls and the ramparts. You have to go out and get to the place where the trouble starts and try to put that place out of business.
Leonard defended American carriers in the first battle between carriers in the Coral Sea in the spring of 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea is 2 days of chaotic fighting, a shootout among obscuring clouds and mists. For the flight crews of the American carriers, it will be a trial by fire as they test themselves against veteran Japanese fighter and bomber pilots. Both sides have difficulty in finding and identifying their opponents. At one point, Japanese aircraft even attempt to land on American carriers. At the end of the battle, despite losing a carrier, the U.S. Navy has stopped the enemy's expansion into New Guinea and destroyed Japan's aura of invincibility. The stage is now set for the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific campaign at a place called Midway. Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, using information obtained from broken Japanese secret codes, orders 3 American carriers to Midway. Here, the task force will intercept Yamamoto's battle group of 6 aircraft carriers. On Midway Island, it becomes a waiting game. On June 3rd, 1942, the waiting ends. The Japanese strike at Midway's airstrip. But unlike Pearl Harbor, radar warnings have been heeded, and most U.S. planes are aloft. Damage is minimal. As the strikes continue on Midway, U.S. carriers secretly launch their attack.
What killed the Japanese attack at Midway? It was dive bombers. The dive bombers were able to dive on 3 of the Japanese carriers without any fighter opposition. And you say, well, where were all these vaunted Japanese Zeros? Well, I'll tell you where the Zeros were. They were down at sea level practically, shooting at our torpedo planes. The Japanese, for a very good reason, were terrified at the thought of torpedo attack from torpedo planes.
I was the only one chasing them. I didn't want the carrier attack, so I fired toward the enemy. And as I lifted up, I saw 2 of them falling. We were taught that Americans were afraid. I don't think so. In that 20-plane formation, as planes were shut down, the rest would fill in and go forth bravely. I was very impressed.
Basically, it was the torpedo planes that kept the fighters down. Torpedo 8 was the first to sight the Japanese fleet. My understanding is that Waldron tried to call the fighters down to give him some protection, but they didn't come down. So they went in, and one by one were all shot down.
The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers proved the loss of the low-flying American torpedo bombers not to be in vain. They attack, virtually unchallenged by the Japanese fighters. The Japanese carriers are now alone and vulnerable.
The dive bombers came in, and there were no fighters. They just had a clear shot. The carriers' decks were completely loaded with ammunition and bombs, and the dive bombers were able to make runs without any fighter interference at all. And that's how they won the battle.
Midway ends Japan's dream of empire. They will never recover from the loss of 4 carriers and 234 of their best pilots. Two months after Midway, the Pacific War shifts to the Solomon Islands, where Japan will lose its more experienced pilots, many of them at Guadalcanal, which became known to the Japanese as the Island of Death. Located south of Japan's major naval and air base at Rabaul, Guadalcanal threatens Allied supply lines. To stop the Japanese construction of an air base, American troops invade Guadalcanal. It is the first Allied amphibious action of the Pacific. The Guadalcanal campaign is the beginning move of a land, sea, and air campaign to recover the Solomons and force Japan from Rabaul. After the capture of Guadalcanal, American engineers quickly complete and then expand the airstrip. It will be known as Henderson Field.
When we got to Guadalcanal, I didn't believe that you could be standing in mud and have dirt blowing in your face. That was the darndest bit of island I've ever been on in my life.
For the next 6 months, U.S. troops defend Henderson Field from land, sea, and air attacks as the Japanese seek to regain control of the island. The long-range capabilities of their bombers and fighters allow Japanese strikes against Guadalcanal from as far away as Rabaul. Leading many of the Japanese bombing missions is the Mitsubishi G4M, codenamed Betty. It has great range, but like so many Japanese aircraft, it offers little armored protection for its 7-man crew. From August to November of 1942, nearly 100 Japanese Bettys are lost at Guadalcanal. Avenger pilot Doug LaPierre recalls a Betty nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie.
Washing Machine Charlie was the Japanese bomber that came down to the islands every night just to annoy people and drop 1 or 2 bombs and keep you awake. We had one night run against Rabaul where we all flew in over Hospital Ridge and dropped torpedoes. And the fun part of that one was Washing Machine Charlie was returning to Rabaul as we were flying out. All the searchlights, Japanese searchlights, went up on poor old Washing Machine Charlie, and I could just picture what he was screaming down at them, and they shot him out of the sky as we ducked out of there about 50 feet above the water and went home.
LaPierre's plane, the Grumman TBF Avenger, originally designed solely as a torpedo bomber, proves so adaptable that it soon becomes the only bomber an aircraft carrier needs. Grumman would build over 10,000. And by 1943, the Avenger would be the most common of carrier bombers.
When the TBF went aboard ship, it was the heaviest and largest carrier-based airplane that had ever been constructed. The government gave Grumman, who was the designer and the original manufacturer, a very simple requirement. They used what we lovingly referred to as the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid.
Rugged and reliable, the Avenger helped stop Japan from retaking Guadalcanal. As Allied air forces gain control of the air, Japan is no longer able to support its troops isolated on many islands throughout the Pacific. In January of 1943, Japan abandons Guadalcanal. The prolonged battle has decimated the ranks of her veteran pilots. Those pilots had received 700 hours of flight training. By contrast, the new Japanese recruits receive only 150 hours. They are brave, but very inexperienced.
We were able to rescue our pilots, put them back in with all the experience they had, and the Japanese kept losing pilots and obviously had no real replacements for them. As the war went on, we got stronger and they got weaker.
Throughout the Pacific, Allied air power isolates Japanese garrisons. In New Guinea, control of the air enables American paratroopers to drop unchallenged behind enemy lines. Spearheading the drive to liberate New Guinea and the Philippines is the 5th Air Force. Using unorthodox bombing tactics, the 5th is relentless in its attacks on Japanese ships and bases. Their slowly descending parabombs allow low-flying aircraft to escape the shockwave of the released bomb's explosion. Another low-altitude bombing technique used by B-25s skips bombs into the side of an enemy ship. Other B-25s, modified with forward-firing guns, strafe enemy vessels. In the Bismarck Sea, they sink a troop convoy from Rabaul, ending Japanese aspirations in New Guinea. Despite the dominance of Allied air forces, the victories are not without pain and sacrifice. The burial at sea of a dead pilot in his battered plane is a sad reminder of the cost of war. For both sides, there will be many more pilots and planes committed to the deep before this war is over. Unlike the Japanese, some U.S. pilots can be rotated back home to train new recruits. Some of these veteran airmen become the subjects of war bond and recruiting films.
You see, it's a matter of teamwork. It's the plane and the engines and the guns. It's the pilot and all the rest of the squadron. It's the guys in the air and the crew on the ground. You people back here will build the planes and push these changes through for us. The riveters, the welders, the assemblers, the foremen, and all the rest. I don't know how to say it exactly. It's just something you gotta feel. It's a team all pulling together. And when it's clicking right, well, you just can't beat it, that's all.
Rated by many as the best fighter of the war, the F-4U Corsair is superior to the Zero in almost every performance category. Though early models have some difficulty landing on aircraft carriers at first, they soon become the plane of choice for many carrier pilots.
I hate Corsairs because they shot down so many of my men. Just hearing the name makes me angry.
Entering combat in 1943, the Corsair is one of the most effective Allied fighter planes of the war. Losing less than 200 of their own aircraft, Corsair pilots shoot down more than 2,000 enemy planes. A deadly partner of the Corsair is the P-38 Lightning. It is used extensively in Europe as well as the Pacific. It becomes famous in the Solomons as the aircraft that takes part in the longest fighter intercept operation of the war, the mission to hunt down Admiral Yamamoto. On April 18, 1943, an enemy Mitsubishi Betty bomber carrying Admiral Yamamoto departs on an inspection tour of Japanese bases. From monitoring secret Japanese codes, the Allies know the exact schedule of Yamamoto's mission. The order is given to intercept his plane. Loaded with extra fuel tanks to accommodate the 435-mile mission, 16 P-38s, led by pilot John Mitchell, prepare for the aerial intercept. As part of the kill team, Rex Barber's orders were to go after Yamamoto's plane.
We knew we were after Yamamoto, and we had instructions from headquarters at all cost, get him. Well, we had to find him first, and then we had to get him. And we really thought we would fly up there and come back with nothing. We just didn't feel we'd find him. Because if you've done much flying, you know how difficult it would be to intercept an airplane on those conditions. That's what surprised everybody, was the bogey's 11 o'clock high call. There he was.
For Zero pilot Kinji Yanagiya, it was a deadly surprise.
It was a ceremonial escort. I never dreamed that we would be attacked by P-38s and have the Admiral shot down. They came in from behind us, low below the jungle, and I was not able to protect him.
The P-38s strike quickly. Yamamoto's aircraft, one of the two Bettys to go down, crashes through the jungle canopy. For Yamamoto, the war is over. The Japanese Empire loses its leading figure, a warrior whose strategic vision will never be replaced. By the end of the war, more than 8,000 P-38s have been built. Designed as a high-altitude interceptor, it uses its high speed and its superior altitude to dive at opponents, its nose-mounted cannon and 50 caliber machine guns blazing. The Lightning is deadly. It shoots down more Japanese aircraft than any other U.S. plane. The mobility and power of American carrier task forces enable the U.S. Pacific Fleet to attack anywhere in the Pacific. John Condon remembers the awesome scale of carrier operations.
People were awestruck when they'd take off and go up and look, and as far as you could see, there were carriers and capital ships, battleships and cruisers, and just literally hundreds and hundreds of them.
By 1944, Allied forces are advancing on the Philippines and closing in on Japan. Japanese and American carriers would duel again in the Marianas. In the Marianas, the Japanese fleet, supported by land-based bombers, waits for the advancing American forces. Though both sides have the same number of aircraft, there is now a great difference in the quality of those pilots and planes.
We went home, came back in Hellcats. And it was a totally different war in Hellcats. By the time we got back, we had, for instance, we'd go on fighter sweeps. We'd have 250 fighters. They called us the Big Blue Blanket.
Though less maneuverable than a Zero, the Hellcat is superior in speed, armor, and high-altitude performance. Over the course of the war, the Hellcat will shoot down more than 6,000 Japanese aircraft, 75% of all Navy kills, at a cost of 270 U.S. planes.
The Hellcat was perfectly suited. It had armor, it had the firepower, it had the maneuverability, it had the performance that we needed, and it could do everything except really outturn a Japanese airplane on a one-on-one basis. And of course, with the tactics we used, very seldom did we get on a one-on-one basis. You know, we lived in the thing we called a target-rich environment. It was never a problem of finding them, it was a problem of surviving. We survived mainly because we just fired and forgot about them. And you turned and somebody else was there and you fired at them and you turned back immediately. And you had to keep turning to make sure your tail there's nobody sitting on your tail. We tried to keep the fight in the same area so that all of us could cover each other, and you can imagine what that is, a big melee with 40 or 50 airplanes just going all directions.
The Hellcat dominates the sky. In what will become known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, 373 Japanese planes are lost to better aircraft and better pilots. From recently captured air bases in the Marianas, a new bombing campaign begins. The destination is Japan, and the aircraft, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. With its 141-foot wingspan and 20,000-pound bomb load, the B-29 is the largest and most powerful bomber of the war. It is also the most innovative. Heated and pressurized cabins allow the 10-man crew to work at high altitudes without oxygen masks and bulky flight gear. Its computerized gun control system allows the B-29's 12 50 caliber machine guns to provide deadly protection against hostile aircraft. As the key weapon in a strategic bombing campaign of Japan, the B-29 rains death and destruction on Japanese cities and industries. Traditional bombing proves much less effective than firebombing, which burns to the ground huge portions of Japan's cities with their wooden structures. Just 450 miles from Japan, Iwo Jima's island defenses are softened for an amphibious assault. A key element in the B-29 bombing campaign, the capture of Iwo Jima will create a life raft for crippled B-29s and an airbase for fighter support. For those who will hit the beach, Iwo Jima becomes a nightmare of death and destruction. It is an island of volcanic ash that looks like a hell on earth. Soldiers on the ground call for air-to-ground support. Since there is no aerial opposition, some Corsairs and Hellcats are modified solely for support missions of bombing and strafing. Iwo Jima is a deadly killing field. It is a battle waged on the ground to support the battles waged in the air. A battle won by Marines advancing inch by inch, fighting an enemy determined to resist to the last man. The cost is high, but Iwo Jima falls. Over the course of the war, more than 2,000 aircraft, unable to make it all the way back to the Marianas, find a temporary home at Iwo Jima. Based permanently there are North American P-51 Mustangs. They provide fighter cover for the superfortress. Near the end of the Pacific Campaign, Mustangs, similar to this one, spend much of the war escorting B-29s over Japan. Its agility and maneuverability make it the favorite of many pilots as they sweep the sky free of Japanese aircraft. Free of escort duties, the Mustang is an effective fighter bomber for tactical airstrikes against Japanese industries. By 1945, Japan has few aircraft that can challenge the American domination of the air. Increasingly vanquished, growing ever more desperate, Japan now looks to the gods for a weapon to save the sacred homeland. That weapon will be the kamikaze. Their ceremonial headbands are symbolic ties to the warrior tradition and the samurai ethic of self-sacrifice for the honor of one's ancestors, one's emperor, one's country. Such willingness to die for a cause makes the kamikaze pilots deadly weapons, against whose lethal suicidal attacks there is little defense. Since their deaths are deaths of honor, to face a kamikaze attack is to face a force that goes beyond planes and bombs to a deeply spiritual dedication. The kamikaze are human bombs, their missions one-way flights to death and eternal glory.
There are two types of kamikaze. The veterans, like myself, who lost at Rabaul, lost at the Philippines, and stayed alive. Later, there were young ones from the mainland. Those people who had only flown for half a year. I didn't understand these student soldiers who wished to die as a kamikaze. Many of the veterans had seen most of their comrades shot down and were losing hope. So this was the only way out.
In defense of Okinawa, the kamikaze attack on April 6, 1945. Radar-controlled American anti-aircraft batteries take their toll on any planes that manage to escape the prowling Hellcats and Corsairs. The kamikaze sink 26 ships at a cost of more than 1,900 of their own aircraft. But for all of its power and will, Japan's suicide weapon will not be able to protect its homeland from the final American attack.
Japanese Zeros like these fought doggedly to attack Allied positions and defend the Imperial Empire. However, by 1945, Japan's Air Force was nearly wiped out. America ruled the air. Its scientists had produced the only weapon that could tame the unconquerable spirit of the Japanese, who were prepared to resist to the last man.
On September 15, 1945, little more than a month after the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrenders unconditionally. Finally, the door is closed on the Second World War, and the dawning of the nuclear age initiates a new chapter in military aviation and world history.